Well, Christa, thank you very much for coming and spending some time with us today. I think it'll be a little bit of a different discussion, just given your background, the companies you've been involved with versus some of the software companies we had earlier. So we're going to get to all the typical topics of how do you manage growth and all that. But I want to start with kind of how you got to where you are. I know you're the sixth of 7 kids.
I am.
I'm the youngest of 8. So I understand what it's like to be in a big family, but I'm curious.
Did you get beaten up as much as I did?
I got humbled. Still scars today. But also everyone told me I was spoiled, which I don't necessarily believe.
The baby in the family
yes,
usually
of course.
is.
But anyway, I'm curious about how that family dynamic, growing up in a big family, kind of impacted, you as a CEO, or how you think about leadership.
Yeah, so 6 to 7 kids, grew up in Western Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh. And, just to even get noticed, I felt like I had to be something extraordinary. All of the firsts had been done in my family, good and bad. And truly by the time I came around, my parents were like, don't get arrested, don't get pregnant, go. And so I didn't really have a lot of...
I didn't even get that done.
I didn't have a lot of rules. I kind of managed myself. And one of the biggest, transformational things for me actually was playing sports. I played both high school and college sports. I played basketball and I ran cross country. But it was where I first learned to, lead a team, fail, get back up, just all of the components. And actually, as a woman in business, it was also, I got really used to playing on the field also with men. And I think it was one of those things that it gave me a lot of confidence of, it doesn't matter what the playing field looks like, I can go toe to toe.
Interesting. So Becky kind of outlined your career arc. You started on Wall Street, which I don't know if she mentioned. Came up through finance, ultimately kind of running a business unit, and then into the CFO suite and into the CEO suite. Most of our CEOs are probably more product driven. So how did the finance background either help or hurt you as a CEO and how you grow a company? Yeah,
I think it adds certainly some things. I think, one of the things that certainly added for me was pattern recognition. If you're starting a company, you often get to see just that company. But I was getting to, have looks at hundreds of companies, if not probably thousands of companies through, just spending time with them, trying to bring them public, trying to learn. And so you start to understand business model, kind of patterns, what something looks like small, something at scale, what does Wall Street value, what does it not value. So you start to really get a good sense of, what is going to ultimately yield value for a set of investors. And I think, I then became a student of business models. And I think one of the things that people often dismiss is the importance of business model as part of product market fit. And I think so often, you get caught up in the technology, you get caught up in, and for a long time, there was a sense of distaste almost the business or revenue, around here. And when you think about the truly iconic companies, not only did they have product innovation, but they have business model innovation as well. Google's the best example of that, ever, which is, they took, they stole the business model from Overture, but they ultimately innovated pretty dramatically on, a self-serve part, part of advertising, and now one of the largest advertisers in the world. And so I think that was the thing that certainly helped me. Now certainly I'm not a deep product person, although I did go to Carnegie Mellon where everybody had to learn how to code, and I think that got ingrained in me, so I was very unafraid to ask technological questions. And one of the things that I always found was interesting when I felt like I was asking what I thought to be a really stupid question, and if I occasionally got blank stares, it was surprising to me when the tech part of the organization maybe didn't have all the ducks in the row that they were supposing to. So not getting fooled by maybe not having that deep technical expertise.
So you brought up an interesting point about understanding and appreciating the business side, not just the product side. How do you feel? What advice would you give to our mostly product-driven CEOs today about that business side? How do you come to appreciate it? How do you get direct experience with it so you can understand it? Or is it just you got to trust the business person that you hire to drive the business side.
Well, and I think Rajesh talked about it too, that it was the business model that led to some of the limitations at Microsoft. And I think, even at OpenTable, the business model is what it had, curtailed some of the growth, and we had to reimagine the business model to find new paths of growth. So oftentimes, as a founder, you're sitting there trying to get, original product market fit, and sometimes you'll figure out how to monetize that original product market fit. But if you want to continue to grow, we talked about, creating long-lasting value. You have got to figure out, oftentimes it's you have to morph that business model over time. You have to create, adjacencies to that original business model. And so I think not being wed to that, one thing. So at OpenTable, for example, we, many people don't realize we are a B2B2C company. So our go-to-market team is about 700 people, and we primarily put software into restaurants. And it took 12 years for and we charge a $249 a month software fee, and then we charge $1 a head. And the simplicity of that was extraordinary. You could explain it in an elevator ride up and down, and it really helped OpenTable get to where it was. And it took 12 years for the $1 per head revenue to surpass the monthly SaaS fee. But then fast forward 20 years later, that $1 per head wasn't serving us anymore. We were ostensibly trying to become a, marketing vehicle for restaurants, putting butts in seats. And, we would charge the $1 Friday at 7 o'clock or Tuesday at 5 o'clock, regardless of the value that we were essentially driving. So the simplicity then lost out to, direct value connotation, and so now we're morphing that and really becoming an almost building AdSense for restaurants. And so looking at the full stack of impression tracking all the way down to reporting, so that we can better deliver. And there's many companies that have done this. Interestingly, Zillow I think has made 5 different business model transitions over its lifetime. I think it's something that you have to continue to look at, whether it's new products or new business models, or looking at different customers that you're serving. How do you crest through what Eugene Wei likes to call these invisible asymptotes? He's a product manager that came out of Amazon, and I think it is this thing where it's like, what are those blind spots that you can't see as a company that are going to curtail growth going forward, and then how do you start to work your way through them? And I think business model is a big component of that.
Talk about the business model at Nextdoor and what evolutions you went through there, if any.
Well, there was none when I got there. So it was really at the period of the instantiation of the business model, and so one of the things I was like, it was very clear that ads were eventually going to be a part of it, and it had a feed mechanism, and there were analogs out there in the form of Facebook that made it very clear what that business model probably needed to be. However, I think the mistake that a lot of companies make is waiting too long. And I always look at, a business model can't be like a barnacle that you put on the side of the ship and then hope that the ship's going to steer in another direction. At the end of the day, it should be endemic to the product. That's why I keep going back to, product market fit often needs to include business model. And if you look, and it was a misnomer, frankly, that some of these companies waited forever. I went back in time and looked at okay, when was $1 in LinkedIn? When was $1? And it was pretty early on. And what you saw was they were tweaking and turning, and they got the engine and the muscle of bringing revenue into the organization relatively early in order to then morph it over time and see what was working. And I think one of the things, the other mistake that people make is, early TAM, early customers, those are often your best customers, and they will pay something that maybe the rest of the market will not. And so how do you continue to test the bounds of what you think that early business model is going to yield and what's really going to be, when you're a $1 billion, $2 billion, $10 billion revenue company?
Great. I want to kind of back to your journey. What was one of the kind of biggest surprises when you stepped into the CEO suite that you didn't anticipate, or one of the biggest challenges when you first took over?
Yeah, well, a couple things. One, so I'd been in GM roles at Disney, and so you're running your own business unit, you have your own P&L, but the deep appreciation for culture. And, I always like to joke that culture is not foosball tables and free lunch. Culture is how people make decisions when you're not in the room. And what you also realize is that as CEO, you are the steward of that culture. You are not the culture. And so what you learn quickly is that, what I reward has an impact on the culture, because the culture is ultimately looking and scanning the horizon and saying, how do I stay safe? Okay, and there's legends in your culture, remember that time when Bob did this and he got fired? That stuff will live forever. He took a risk and he got fired, and therefore no one in the history is gonna ever take a risk again because it seems unsafe. And so you have to then go, okay, well, when I got to OpenTable, there was it was a fear-based culture. And so it was I can't I can't do all these things. And by definition, there is no reward without risk. You have to be, taking risks inside a company. And so what I had to figure out was, how am I going to get this company to start taking some risk? And so I had to make it unsafe to not take risk inside the company. And so that was a really interesting thing, was the power, and it really becomes a force multiplier for your business. I think the thing that was surprising was how much every single word, action, utterance, email gets amplified and noticed. And so I would, see a product manager in the hallway, and I'd be like, this one thing on this one part, I would really, and then before you know it, they're building a whole new thing, and you go, oh shit. It was so I will then preface comments to saying, okay, this is N of 1. Take it for that, or this is Christa the consumer, this is Christa the restaurateur, this is Christa the CEO, this is Christa the, I define who I am in the comments so that it is not, reconfigured, because, and it's amazing because, again, the organization is there ultimately, they do want to please, and they do want to figure out what is going to make them successful in that moment, but you can go way off the deep end on, crazy things and crazy analyses if you're not careful.
Got it. So CEOs have a lot of demands, right? We've heard it earlier today. You've got customers, you've got employees, you've got investors. Given your experience, how do you balance all of those things, especially in a company that's going, experiencing exponential growth?
Yeah, I think it is, there is a rank order. In our case, we were a two-sided marketplace, so we had diners and restaurants. And I think, paying a ton of attention to your customer, that will always serve you. So, but in order to do that, in order to pay attention, you have to start with your employees. And I think as CEO, you probably recognize very early on, you cannot do it yourself. And so creating a structure and environment where your employees really feel like they're in position to do their best work. So I really start at the employee level and really focus there. And then it is, getting them into position to drive and help build the best possible products or sell the best possible products into our customers. If we're doing a good job there, then I've got revenue and my investors are happy. And I also am a whole person. So, I have 2 kids, I have a husband, how do you fit it all in? And I think, for me, there is no balance. There's just massive integration. And I talk about what I'm doing with my employees, with the restaurant community, and vice versa. And so I think it is, trying to find that space of connection to your own values and your own beliefs. And when you are there, then, how you're going through that process and all those constituencies just kind of fall into place.
There's a trend, kind of radical transparency inside of organizations. You've got some big ones that practice it. Others are in different elements of the scale, sharing everything, revenue by day, employee compensation, et cetera. How important is transparency in, you talk about culture and all of that. Where on that transparency spectrum do you think we should be operating?
Yeah, the Ray Dalio.
Yes.
We started, I'll start with radical candor, which is a little bit different than radical transparency. And we became sort of the poster children for radical candor. And if you haven't read Kim Scott's book, you should, because I would say OpenTable was in a ruinously empathetic state before we moved over to radical candor. And so, radical candor starts out with, do I care for you personally, and do I want to get shit done? That's sort of the shorthand of it. And it requires you to have really difficult conversations. So step one is create an environment where people feel very comfortable having the very difficult conversations. In my first staff meeting, we had more of a command and control environment, and I asked them, I was like, now disagree with me, and it was like crickets. And then we got to the point where, yes, they felt very comfortable challenging me, because I wanted to have a structured environment, because if the people closest to me challenged me, then we were forged and fortified almost by the time we get out into the public market. Any opposition or any viewpoint that could be had, I already had the answer to it, because my team had brought it up. We had already pushed it around and thought through it. On the radical transparency end of the spectrum, I think the compensation, I think that you should be doing things in your organization. So we certainly made sure that we went and did the gender pay equity analysis and worked through that, did not have issues there. I think, there are circumstances sometimes, I always tell the team, does it pass the printer test? So if all the salaries ended up on the printer, although no one uses printers anymore, but if it ended up on the printer, did you feel like you could justify it? I think there's a little bit of a difference, putting it on the wall, because there are different circumstances and there are different, and so I go back and forth around it. I want to make sure that you're doing the right thing and being systematically honest, but so the salaries thing, I'm kind of mixed on, because I know some of the edge cases and it can cause distraction, but again, you should be doing the means testing inside and making sure that you don't have any bias in your results. Certainly on the results of the company, covers are, our most important metric, and those get reported out daily, and people should feel like they have ownership and understanding of what those are, and if they're not operating, or if something, an issue, there's a hurricane, there's something that causes a disruption, people should know it and feel somewhat empowered to go act upon it.
I love the radical candor versus transparency, so I'm going to use that, so thank you. Shifting gears, just kind of getting a little more tactical, and scale, right? I heard earlier, certain breakpoints. In your experience, right, as a company grows, what are those kind of natural inflection points that you've seen? What are the issues around those, and how do you manage through them?
Yeah, I have a very schizophrenic background. I go big company, small company, and I've kind of watched them all almost, my time at Disney was almost, I would look at it almost in an anthropological way. How do you move around 100,000 people? And in my experience, there is this interesting exponential curve of breakage. At 50 people, 150 people, 500, 2,000, 10,000, 50,000. And the reason it works like that is essentially what starts to happen is the decision trees fan out. So when you start your company, you can get everybody in the room and be like, we're going to go do this, let's go. And then, you're at 150 people, and now you're at Dunbar's number. And so your ability to organize beyond that is, in effect, your ability to create myth and legend and story and narrative about what it is that you need to go do. And if you, are the person who's loves to just gather people in a room and rally them, can't do that anymore. And so now you have to think about new ways of communicating. You have to repeat yourself. I had one founder who's like, I told the company the vision, and they keep asking me it over and over and over again. Why do they do that? I already explained it. And I said, it's because they want to know, do you still believe? Do you still believe in that vision? And so you have to continue to get that sort of rally, and how you do that changes over time. And also just think about, the average manager can only handle about 10 people. So, you're now at a 2,000 person organization, you have 200 managers. Now your managers have surpassed Dunbar. So how do you get the managers of the managers of the managers? And so, one of the things I like to do was sort of a reactive leaning in, because the worst thing you can do is put a banal process on with a bunch of engineers, because they will just they will kill you. And so it would be okay, I'd wait for something to break, which it always did. And breakage should be something you look forward to. It's like a snake shedding its skin. You got to break to grow. So look at the breakage as an opportunity, and this is a good thing. We're breaking, it means we're growing. But take the opportunity and say, okay, what broke? Okay, who's there? And I often find that the people who are good at seeing the breakages are often not the people who can fix the breakage. So I really relied on my horizontal purview people. So CFO, general counsel, head of HR, they're seeing across the organization that your vertical people are not. And so oftentimes, if their antenna are up, you can start seeing, hey, what is breaking? Now let's go figure out, okay, solve it. Maybe you put in a little bit of process. Maybe you put in a new communication device, because all of those changes start to really impact your ability to grow, and the messiness of that and the speed with which you can, kind of move through those breakage is, often determine whether or not you're going to succeed or fail.
So how do you make decisions in those, as you're growing that quickly without having to slow down or trying not to slow down? I mean, it's inevitable. The bigger you get, longer it takes decisions because of all these layers. How do you cut through that, or can you cut through it?
And I'm a collaborative thinker, which is sometimes annoying because I like to debate a lot. So, for me anyway, it was like, here's what we got to go through. I'm going to get a bunch of input. We're going to, push the clay around, as I like to say. And then I'm going to make the call. But oftentimes you got to get comfortable, I think, making decisions without perfect information. And, there's always sort of the person who, wants all the data. And it's like, well, by the time you get all the data, you're too late. And so it's this mix of data and intuition. And oftentimes it's like, how do we get people to get enough data and enough signal in the market that we know where and when to go? So usually for me, there's some data acquisition process, a little bit of scrap. As Abraham Lincoln said, I love a good scrap. So we do a little scrap, and then it's go. And then you have to also recognize which decisions. I mean, Bezos talks about this all the time. Which decisions can you walk back from, and which decisions can you not? Most decisions you can walk back from. And so, man, let's just go, move.
So you've mentioned in the past about increasing velocity, and you tried this at OpenTable.
Yeah.
What does that mean? Is that what we were just talking about?
Yeah, I think it is what we were just talking about. I mean, and recognizing and kind of, we put in an A/B testing culture, which hadn't really been there before. And so just getting people and rewarding people for the speed of the testing or the speed of the, less the outcome of it. Because if people are worried about whether the outcome is going to be good or bad, they're going to slow themselves down, overthink it. Let's just keep going. I mean, when my head of HR started, he made fun of me because I think 5 of the values that I had talked about were essentially move faster. It was like progress over perfection, make it happen, find the testable hypotheses. And he's like, half of these are basically go. And you have to recognize the culture that I found upon entry there, which was, there was a fear based and there was a fear to move, and for good reason. I mean, we were on the B2B side of our business. I mean, we are the system of record, and we had to be more bulletproof. And we would ship, again, historically it was once a year. We got to monthly when we ultimately moved to our cloud product. And then the consumer side, we ship daily. And so there was also this weird, bifurcation within the organization between, the B2B product and the B2C product.
Got it. Before the robots take over all of our jobs, we need people, right, to build these businesses. How do you build a high-performance team? How do you hire to ensure quality as a company gets exponentially larger?
Yeah, and I wish, I had the perfect formula. I think on an executive team, I think there was some comment earlier around, the minute it's not working, cut. Go. Because I've never waited too long to make a change on a person. And it's actually kinder for the other person too. When you know that it's not going to work, drawing it out. And there were various times where I was simultaneously the head of product, the head of HR, the head of CFO, because I would just move on a decision. Of the 12 people that were on our executive team, I ended up, after 2 years, I had kept 2 and shrunk it to 7. So you have to be making those changes. The other challenge I think that was brought up earlier, which is the most heartbreaking part of growing a company and scaling a company is the people who took you from 0 to 50 are often not the people who are going to take you to 50 to 150 or 500. And rare is the bird that can travel that distance, and some of them can, they certainly can, and that is definitely possible, but a lot cannot. And it's super heartbreaking because these are often, cultural cornerstones inside your company. They helped get you where you are. There's a loyalty there, but it's often not the right thing for them or the company. But in terms of hiring, one of the basic things is really, there's a, three circle diagram of, what is the person good at? What do they like to do, and what does the company need them to do? And if all of those sit on top of each other, you're in a pretty good space. And it's always surprising to me, somebody will come in and interview for a job, and if I think about the locus of what they'll be doing, and they don't even really like to do that. And I'm like, do you realize this is like 80% of the job? And they're like, yeah, but I also like, and so what I'm really trying to look at is like, when do their eyes light up when they're talking about their job? Because if they're bringing that energy and passion, they'll work 10 times harder and be happier doing it. And so I'm always trying to look at where those things line up. Are they, illuminated by that? Can they not stop thinking about it? And then you usually end up with but I've also made, I've made, you wish you bat 1,000, and I've made mistakes, and you just try and move back from those as quickly as you can.
All right, I want to challenge one of the, I guess, fundamental premises of a lot of what we heard today is about growth, right? And growth is important. You talked about breaking things as companies get bigger. Should CEOs be maximizing near-term growth always, or is there something to be said about sustainable long-term growth? And if so, where within that journey do you focus on sustainable growth versus maximizing near-term growth?
Well, and I'll kind of put my analyst hat on a little bit, and I think, again, as an investor, you'd much rather have the company that can sustainably grow, over the next 10 years than something that shark fins. Look at Snap right now. You've got, came out with a blast and it's struggling to find growth. And so I think as long as you're growing north of, the line of demarcation was always 25%. So if you can grow faster than 25%, you don't have to profit optimize. You can, continue to, but it's much worse to grow 150% and then 0%. I think the idea is the predictability of cash flows is also what drives a multiple. And so to the extent that you have, excessive volatility in beta, you're just not going to get treated the same way in the marketplace. And your ability to manage through all that is 10 times harder. So what you've done is amp the degree of difficulty. So crazy growth at all costs with no sustainability is definitely not the pathway. And so I think you have to look and say, okay, well, what are the sustainable ways of growing? One of the things I did at OpenTable is I got rid of our ad business. It was a nice profit contributor, and it, dinged a little bit. It was just, we were not going to invest in it. So was it going to be a sustainable piece of growth that year after year after year I could, count on growth on? And the answer was no. And so I chose to get rid of it as more of a sustainability effort.
Got it. You have a unique perspective because you've done a lot of M&A in your past, right? At Playdom, you were I think you were banker for the company as well as on the sell side. In OpenTable, you've done some acquisitions as well. For the CEOs in the crowd who either entertain acquisitions, what are some of the lessons learned, pros and cons, things to, pitfalls to be aware of?
Yeah, I've bought and have been bought. And so on the buying side, I think a couple things. Well, it depends if you're doing kind of acqui-hire, strategic acquisition, financial acquisition, and they're all different. In the acqui-hire, obviously you're paying attention to the quality of the team. Although, I'm somewhat dubious that you couldn't just pluck people out, but there's the acqui-hire, and I did a fair amount of those. And then I think there's this strategic acquisition versus financial acquisition, and the financial acquisition, you're sitting there and going, okay, bolting this business on, you're looking at the cash flow and all that good stuff. But at the end of the day, if you're invested as a senior leadership team, the likelihood of success is very high. If you're not super invested, then the likelihood of failure is pretty high. And so I think one of the things that, a good process to do is, say you're down the path and you're like ready to buy this company, do a stoplight meeting. Like basically do all the reasons why this is going to fail. And it's almost like, they talked about pre-mortems earlier, but I think especially with acquisitions, doing the pre-mortem of truly what can go wrong, and then you either don't do the deal or you do the deal eyes wide open. Now, yeah, I also sold ourselves. I basically acted as the banker when we sold ourselves to Disney, and that was also interesting because, and in hindsight, maybe I should have had a banker because we got really punishing due diligence requests that were actually. It turns out they were trying to time it with the Miramax sale, so it was really brutal on us. But it would have been nice to have an intermediary that didn't have to work with them later. But it was a good process because it was really trying to align the beliefs and the system. But I think it's like really understanding and knowing why are you doing this, and then I think making sure that you have executive leadership buy-in in order to make that thing successful, because a lot of deals obviously don't cut it.
Right. Okay. We have one last question. I think we go to Q&A after. Diversity and inclusion. It's something I know it's important to you. You've been very vocal about. What are some real concrete things our entrepreneurs can do to get serious about diversity and inclusion within their business?
And the reason why I've been vocal about it is, I think it's your fiduciary obligation. All the data is super clear. More diverse companies yield better outcomes. I think I saw a McKinsey stat with if women were able to work the same number of hours, work the same jobs in the same industries, the world would be $28 trillion richer. Like, my point is like, your businesses would have a better bottom line if you had diversity. So I look at it as more of a fiduciary obligation. I mean, look what's happened at Google today. I think the world very much is changing and is getting woke. We did not, and I had a moment where, I kind of stood up and called BS on some notion that, why women were not getting ahead. But then I was like, okay, well, let's, put your money where your mouth is. And so I made a commitment to get our company to 50-50. And as I'm sure is the case in most of your companies, where we lagged behind was in the engineering side. And so prior to making a bunch of tactical changes, the number of female engineers we hired in the quarter was 14%. Not great. So, I sat down with our CTO and I said, look, this is really important. Look at our customer base. We're 60% women in our customer base. So the most important thing we did was we declared the importance of a diverse and inclusive workforce at the very, very top. But then we just looked at it like any other problem and say, okay, let's look at our system. And so we looked at the very top. Like, we looked at our job descriptions, and we used a company called Textio to look at how our job descriptions were written. Turns out they were attracting all men. Well, that was a problem. Then we used a company called Canvas that will basically take the gender out, or person of color identifying information out of your resumes. Let's remove bias from just the resume selection process. And then we made sure that we had at least 2 diverse candidates on every slate, because the RE rule doesn't work. Because if you've one diverse candidate, they become the diversity candidate, and their odds of getting hired are 0. Well, literally 0. But if you have 2 candidates, the odds of hiring that person are 80% higher. So we had diverse panels and diverse slates. And then we just talked about it. And so in the first quarter that we did this, we had 50% of the engineers we hired were women. I was like, gee, that didn't seem that hard. And when I realized that this is not a woman's issue, and it's not a man's issue, it's a leadership issue. Your job as leaders is to go make it happen, climb mountains, do the thing, and that's why you get paid. And so it was really shocking and surprising to me. And then I started spending a lot of time at my alma mater, Carnegie Mellon, and 50% of their graduates in computer science are women. And so I spent some time trying to understand, well, how did you do that? How did you get there? And they said, look, first of all, it took leadership and intention, period. Can't do it without that. But they did put extra, support infrastructure in place to get, for the women. And then a funny thing happened when it got to half. The women were like, why do we have all this extra stuff? And it turned out once you got to half, they didn't need any of that. They didn't need anything extra. And I think it's an important lesson to say the road to get there may be a little more challenging. But again, as leaders, the outcome from your business is going to yield a better result. And I don't think you want to be late here. I don't think this is where you're going to want to lag.
Great. Well, why don't we open it up to the audience for questions?
I'm Travis Katz. I'm at Skyscanner. I'm curious to hear about how you guys are now part of the Booking group, and Booking's a big travel company, and OpenTable is, restaurant reservations. There obviously is some overlap between those 2 markets, but a lot of differences. And how do you feel what's the strategy in terms of how OpenTable fits in with the broader strategy?
Yeah.
And is there a vision of it coming together, or is it really just a portfolio approach?
I think what you're seeing the holding company do is start to bring them a lot closer together. The original premise for why OpenTable belonged in the largest travel company in the world is, here's a big insight: 100% of travelers need to eat. And so just based on that alone, if you look at OpenTable's data, the very best customers on OpenTable use us in 2 markets or more. So if, it's a massive frequency jump. And so, one of the things we spend a lot of time is, okay, let's look at the travel condition. If I can draw a polygon around your hotel, the lat long of your hotel, I can now make good, restaurant recommendations that sit within it. I think culturally, historically, it had been run very separate, very autonomous, almost like Berkshire Hathaway, and I think that's changing, and the pieces are getting pushed closer together.
No? All right. Well, I've got a lightning round if no one.
Cool.
It's always fun. All right. What do you like best about the CEO role?
The decision making.
What do you like least?
The lack of stasis.
Okay. Personality trait that's been most beneficial in your career?
Extreme extroversion.
All right. Personality trait that's gotten you in the most trouble?
Extreme extroversion.
What's the most courageous thing you've ever done?
Well, I have an ex-Navy SEAL husband, so I've skied down some crazy things and done some crazy mountaineering. But in the business world, I think it has been kind of standing up for women in tech.
All right. A couple of easier ones. Best vacation?
Probably Jackson Hole.
Best restaurant?
Oh, they're all my children. Best business lunch of the city, Murad. I'll give you that. Leo's, have you ever been in the back room? It's just right around the corner, the Tiki Bar.
All right.
It's very special.
All right, last one. Best advice ever been given to you?
Be yourself. Be authentic. It took me, it's funny, I spent a good part of my career truly showing up as someone else to fit in. I always say sometimes, like, I showed up as a man to be accepted by men, and then at some point I was like, oh, no, this is pretty good. And actually the best, the most authentic you can be is, when you bring that whole self to work. And, oftentimes I find myself, talking about my kids in a management scenario, or, the issue I had, or, I bring in yoga, and I think all those things make you a leader that people want to get behind. And I spend the time understanding and learning and really appreciating the people around them, and I get to know them in a really deep and intimate way, and I think that forms the trust, which ultimately makes you a great leader.
Great. Well, Christa, thank you once again for taking the time.
So
This
much
has been
fun.
great.
Thank you.
Thanks.